All right, thanks for your patience, everyone, while we got our technical situation sorted. Neil O'Dell, president of the Vermont School Boards Association, is going to get us started.
All right, can you hear me okay? So welcome and thank you for joining us today, everyone. As I'm sure you all know, it's been an unconventional year for the legislature. In August, the Vermont General Assembly reconvened with the primary objective of finalizing the FY21 budget as the COVID-19 crisis continued to evolve. On Friday, September 25th, the session adjourned after passing a number of legislative bills related to education. And this webinar will focus on recapping that month-long special session, particularly as it relates to schools. Before we get started, just a few logistical items. We do ask that you post questions into the question feature of the GoToWebinar. Chelsea Myers of the Vermont Superintendents Association will moderate the questions after each major segment of the agenda today. The session will be recorded. I believe it's being recorded right now and available following the webinar. Your questions will not be identified in any distributed recording of the session. We have a number of panelists that are joining us today. Sorry. My apologies if I broke up there a little bit. I'll put my back for it, folks. Okay, so we do have a number of panelists that are joining us today. And if you folks wouldn't mind just raising your hand as I go through here so folks know who you are. First up is Mark Peralt, who's the Senior Fiscal Analyst with the Joint Fiscal Office. Mark, there's Mark. Next is Brad James, Finance Manager with the Agency of Education. Sue Saglowski, who is the Executive Director of the Vermont School Boards Association. Sue. Jeff Francis, Executive Director for the Vermont Superintendents Association. Jeff has assured us that he is wearing a tie, but unfortunately, because he doesn't have video going, we cannot confirm that. You want to say hi, Jeff?
Hi, everyone.
Tracy Sawyers, who is the Executive Director for the Vermont Council of Special Ed Administrators. A little wave there, Tracy. Thank you. Nathan Lavery, who is President of the Vermont Association of School Business Officials.
Afternoon.
Jay Nichols, Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association. Thank you, Jay. And finally, Sandra Cameron, who is the Director of Public Policy for the Vermont School Boards Association. Thanks, Sandra. The agenda will begin with the several education policy issues taken up in the General Assembly. We'll pause at the end of that segment for questions. Then we will transition into the financial portion of the agenda, beginning with an update on the Education Fund, moving to an account of the finance-related policy passed by the General Assembly, and finally hearing from the Agency of Education and VASBO on the implementation of the federally funded fiscal allocations. We'll pause again for questions at the end of the segment. And then finally, if we have enough time, we will conclude with a few bills not directly connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that, let's jump into the policy items. And I'd like to turn it over to Jay, who will get us started with changes to student attendance days.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We appreciate having everybody here. We've got a lot to cover, so we'll just get started. House Bill 969, also known as the Big Bill, made a significant change to the student attendance day. Title 16, 1071, School Year and School Day, Section A1 is amended, changing the required minimum number of student attendance days from 175 to 170. I want to emphasize that this does not change any other locally bargained agreements or working conditions for teachers or support staff, but solely the number of minimum days required for schools to be open, whether they're open remotely, in hybrid, or in person for students. We can go to the next person.
That's me.
So H 969 is now Act 154, and this act provides for a waiver for private pre-kindergarten programs during the 2020-2021 school year. The waiver allows a provider to retain their qualified status as required in Act 166, despite the loss of the program's licensed early educator or early childhood special educator, provided that 1, the private pre-K provider held the status of pre-qualified prior to March 15th of 2020, and 2, that the private pre-K provider continues to meet all other qualification criteria.
Thank you, Sandra. I guess we go to Sue next for the Australian ballot.
Yes. Australian balloting refers to a system where a ballot is produced prior to the election. There is early and absentee voting available, and voters cast ballots on the election day by marking their ballots privately in a booth and placing them in a ballot box. This is distinguished from votes from the floor at a floor meeting where all voters gather and vote on an article or articles under the direction of a moderator. Normally, the voters of the school district are required to vote to adopt the Australian ballot system if it's not already in use, and the system can then be used for subsequent votes. H 969 authorizes school districts to utilize the Australian ballot system for any and or all of their annual meetings and special meetings by vote of the school board without a separately warned vote of the voters. This option was put in place for the 2020-2021 school year only. It provides flexibility by allowing those districts which normally hold floor votes to use the Australian ballot system, and this will allow them to follow health and safety best practices during the pandemic and the declared state of emergency. And I'm also covering the next topic. Neil, should I just go on to the next topic?
Please, yes, the sunset extension of UUSDs.
So the next one is, it involves how to fill a vacancy on a unified union school district board when there's a vacancy on the board. And it's one of the most frequent questions actually that comes into the VSBA is how to fill a board vacancy in a unified union school district. The legislature has addressed this in the past through session law, which means that the answer is not easily found in the Green Vermont Education Law Book. So, and that's going to be the case here as well. In this case, the legislature has extended a provision which expired on July 1, 2020, addressing the process for filling a vacancy that occurs on the board of a unified union school district when the vacancy is in a seat that is allocated to a specific town. So the process that's outlined in the act that passed is that when the board is notified of a vacancy, the clerk of the Unified Union School District immediately notifies the select board of the town. And within 30 days after the receipt of that notice, the Unified Union School District Board, in consultation with the select board, appoints a person who is otherwise eligible to serve as a member of the board to fill that vacancy, and they only fill it until an election is held at an annual or special meeting, unless there's some other provision in the school district's articles of agreement. And this provision is only in effect until July 1, 2022.
Next up, we have the waiver for online teaching endorsement. So this summer, the Vermont Standards Board for Professional Educators granted a blanket waiver for all licensed educators in the state to be able to teach online without having the online teaching endorsement, given the situation of the pandemic and so much remote teaching going on. That waiver was set to sunset on December 30th, 2020. Our associations and the Agency of Education supported language in the legislature that was approved as part of the big bill that waived the online endorsement requirement for the entire school year of 2020-2021. So for the remainder of this school year, teachers can teach remotely as much as they need to, even without having an online teaching endorsement. starting next school year, unless something changes, then that provision will be back in the law and a teacher would need an online teaching endorsement to do so. And the last part we have for this early part, Tracy on after school programs.
Can you hear me? Different platforms are different places to mute and unmute. On after school programs before the break with COVID, during the beginning of the legislative session, there was work to create a task force to study after school programs throughout the state and to look specifically at revenue sources above and beyond the education fund, but look at some of the cannabis money, et cetera. So that study did get added in the last month. And so that will be happening in this year. Several of the groups are part of the study group on this, VCSEA, school boards, Principal Association, Superintendents Association, and others. So that was something that there was a standalone bill on that at the beginning of the session, and it was added in at the end.
Thank you very much, Tracy. So at this time, we'd like to open it up for questions. Chelsea, could you remind folks how they can submit questions for the webinar?
Yes, on your panel, there should be a tab that says questions. It looks like the old school AIM chat feature. You can type in your question and I'll read it as soon as this segment is over. This is the end of the segment. We only have one question. Oh, I have a lot of frozen people on my screens. Can people still hear me?
Yes, we can.
So I have one question. It's not directly related to any of the topics, but we're ahead of schedule, so I'm going to read it. It says there was a lot of discussion and confusion about what would have been the Townsend Amendment to S-254, which was eventually pulled. I wonder if each association could share with us their position on the topic of the would-be amendment, not the last-minute nature process it went through. So the actual content of the amendment, not the political process. Could Sue, Jeff describe the Townsend Amendment before the others weigh in on what that meant to their associations?
So Chelsea, I could certainly describe the amendment. It was something that we found out about at night, and it was a very a short amendment. It removes some language from the statute that governs the statewide commission that handles bargaining for healthcare benefits for school employees. And currently the language that is in the law requires that all employees would pay the same percentage for their premiums and also for out-of-pocket costs. And it what it did was cross out that language, that requirement. And that requirement had been, when the law was first put into place, it was something that had been sort of negotiated and agreed upon between the VSBA and the Vermont NEA. In that context, it was designed to open up plans to all employees because there were some employees in school districts who were not, did not have access to all the plans.
Thanks, Sue.
Yeah, so I mean, I could certainly weigh in on VSBA's position on this, but I didn't know if anybody else wanted to chime in before I did that. Seeing or hearing none. So I appreciate the question. The VSBA was opposed to the Townsend Amendment. And while I will acknowledge that the questioner specifically asked what our positions were on the substance of the amendment and not to the process, you know, I have to say that the VSBA position on the matter was largely driven by the process that brought it to the table. Regarding the substance of the amendment, it was our position that it had the potential to increase costs for school districts at a time when pressure on local budgets is quite severe and quite onerous. It also increased a level of complexity to determining, it had the potential to increase the level of complexity in determining the contribution for folks that if we're going to adopt a sliding scale system for benefits. So, you know, those were two of the substance related issues, but really from a process perspective, we were very much concerned about the process that was used to actually bring the amendment up for consideration for folks that had been, you know, watching as things had progressed. S226 was the original bill from Senate Education that addressed potential changes to the statewide health care bargaining commission. That bill began early on in the session. Actually, I think it was drafted before the legislative session even started back in January. And the VSBA was invited at that point in time to testify on it. We did, and one of the things that Senate Education and Chair Baruth asked us to do was to meet with the Vermont NEA and see if there were some areas where we could come into an agreement on potential changes to the bargaining commission, the Act 11 that was passed in 2018. We had that meeting, we got together and, you know, found a couple of areas where we might have had some agreement, but there, throughout the course of that bill's development, remained several areas where our organizations were significantly heading in different directions as far as our concerns and what we would like to see changed in the bill. You know, ultimately, S226, as it developed, ended up being something that the VSBA couldn't necessarily get behind. But what happened with the last minute Townsend Amendment was that they cherry picked essentially just one item out of 226 and brought it forward as an amendment to an unrelated bill. And, you know, I just thought that that was bad process for legislating. You know, it didn't give any side the opportunity to effectively weigh the, you know, the pros and cons, the merits or the, you know, challenges associated with that. And it was brought in at the third reading, which left, you know, very little time even for debate within the legislature itself. And so, you know, one of the things that I hope that we do from a VSBA perspective is give boards resources so that they can, you know, be effective local governing bodies for their school systems, but also operate in a transparent manner. And we just didn't think that the process that the legislature was using at the time did that. So while I appreciate the question and wanting to separate the substance of the bill from the process, you know, I find it difficult to do that because for us, the process was a big piece of it. So.
Jeff, do you want to go next or you want me to?
So this is Jeff Francis. I'm on audio only. I think that Neil's response, Executive Director of the Superintendent Association, I think Neil's explanation is absolutely on point. The evolution of that bill had the VSBA taking the largest part of the lead because it was a labor management bill. The General Assembly, the legislative session this year was the most dynamic I think I've experienced. And frankly, had the General Assembly taking more time on that bill and that provision, I'd be able to give you a better answer. We got swept up in the COVID-19 response in March. The General Assembly, for all intents and purposes, dropped all business other than COVID-19 response. And we were caught totally off guard when that amendment got introduced, and literally the 11th hour of the legislative session was later than that. The specific provision has aspects to it that require a lot of analysis. So when all is said and done, if the General Assembly takes that bill and that provision back up in the next biennium, we'll have time to do that analysis. But as Neil indicated, the vigorous objections at the very, very last minute came because it was, quite frankly, in simple terms, very bad process to even introduce that amendment when it got introduced at that point in the session.
So this is Jay Nichols from the Principals Association. Ditto to everything that Neil and Jeff both said. Another aspect of this for us is that principals in this process are represented by Vermont NEA. And no principals in the state that I'm aware of, including or myself or anybody in my office, had any idea this was going to happen at all. So we had no chance to take a look at it. Principals and other administrators tend to work many more days than teachers do, for example. There's also other bargaining units like custodians that work more days. And we had no chance to look at any of this and see if there was going to be any mechanism to try to support people who work longer years than a school year, for example. And without having any of those conversations up front, we couldn't even support going any further with this. So that was a big concern for us as well.
And Chelsea, if I can, just one maybe final point on this, because I think that there was some confusion, that very well might have been related to the process at the very end of this, is that I had heard from some folks who thought that the amendment would have allowed local school boards to negotiate a sliding scale fee system. And our understanding of the bill, which comes not only from a presentation that was made by legislative counsel related to it, but also from speaking with representatives at the time who were familiar with this, was that was not the case at all. And so I just want to clarify that for folks, is that this would have made it a potential subject for bargaining for the statewide health commissioners, but it would not have returned the authority to local school boards to have included this in any local bargaining. So just wanted to add that piece.
All right, Neil, as the moderator, you never have to ask me permission to keep going, but you may move to the next section, which is Mark Peralt's section.
All right, grabbing the mute button. Mark, I don't know that you necessarily need much of an introduction, but we'd love to hear from you at this point.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. Chelsea, do you have the Ed Fund Outlook that I sent? Could you maybe bring that up?
Yes. Do you want me to bring it up, or would you like to have control?
Well, I can try. Let me see. Do I just pop it up?
You should be able to now. Yes.
Okay. There it is. Okay. So I can't see you guys, but that's okay. Just let me know if you have trouble hearing me. This Ed Fund Outlook is virtually identical to the one that we looked at last time we met. I'll go over one small change in a second, but mainly I think I'll just review where we are at this point, take a few minutes to do that, and then answer any questions that you might have. So if you go right down to the bottom line down here on line 31, you can see that we're projecting a $67 million shortfall in FY21, which would carry forward into the next school year, FY22, the year we're starting to move to now. That's slightly higher than the deficit we were projecting last time we met. The change is attributable to a reduction in the use tax safe harbor that was included in H954. It's $775,000 reduction. So it's in the ed fund world, that's next to nothing, but that's the reason for the slight change here. It's not really an education issue, so I won't spend a lot of time on it other than to say that because most vendors are collecting sales tax online now, the safe harbor provisions that were in current law provided for too high of a tax. So there was a slight reduction in the table, and that's the reduction that you'll see in the ed fund. I want to say a little bit, I know Jeff's going to talk about the December 1 letter further on, so I won't get into that other than to direct your attention again to line 31. And you can see that we're showing a $67 million shortfall, but that includes a $38.2 million stabilization reserve up on line 27. So in an accounting sense, the education fund deficit is really only $28.9 million. However, the reserve is empty. Now, because when we get to FY22, the law requires the stabilization reserve to be refilled up to 5%, which would be that 38.2. The House Ways and Means Committee prefers to look at the outlook that combines those two pieces into that $67.1 million down on the bottom line. So anyway, the deficit is not nearly as bad as that $67 million would make you think, but because of the issues that are going to come up in terms of preparing that December 1 letter, they've asked to look at it this way. Now, I don't expect any more changes to show up on the outlook for FY21 until January when we get a new revenue forecast in. The only possible change that we might see is a change in the property tax credit, which is way up here on line, and the revenue sources right up here on line 1B. Other than that, all of the numbers that are reflected in here are either appropriations, which won't change, or part of the revenue forecast that was last done in August. Those numbers, again, won't change until January. So moving into FY22, this is basically the sheet that we're going to be looking at. What's not in here at this point is any money from the coronavirus relief fund. There was, I know we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail later, so I won't dwell on it a lot, but there was about $103 million appropriated for K through 12 in the budget. It's possible that a portion of that money may be able to be recaptured through the education payment, although at this point we don't know, and I think Brad's going to be addressing that later. This sheet at this point also does not reflect any ESSER money. And the only thing I can say about, other things I can say about going forward is at this point, as of last week, the actual collections, the monthly revenue collections that we get every month are indicating that non-property tax revenues to the education fund are up about $12 million over the forecast that's reflected in here. I have no idea at this point whether that's a trend that's going to continue and we'll see better numbers by January, or whether it's just a reflection of the stimulus money that's poured into the state in FY20. But that's about all I can tell you at this point. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to address them.
So I think we'll transition into the next section in case some of those questions are answered, and then move to question and answers after that.
Okay.
So I guess the next part is my turn. It's again Jeff Francis from the Vermont Superintendents Association. I just want to take a really brief moment and express my gratitude to the panelists today. Everybody who is serving as a panelist played an important role in the work that we undertook together in informing the legislative process. So there's a lot of teamwork that's involved, including with the Joint Fiscal Office and the Agency of Education, in terms of informing the legislative process. With respect to the December 1st tax letter specifically, I think many people are aware that under Vermont law, the Commissioner of Taxes is required by December 1st to calculate and recommend statewide education property tax rates. In this case, the letter that will come out in December of 2020 will inform the FY22 budget process. Also under the law, in making the recommendation, the commissioner must calculate the rates at an amount sufficient to cover any projected fiscal year deficit and to maintain the stabilization reserve, which Mark Thrall just spoke about, at 5%. When the General Assembly was navigating the early days of the COVID-19 crisis, they included in Act 122 a provision that said the General Assembly's intent is to address any projected deficit in the education fund for fiscal year 21 by using federal funds, applying reversions, drawing down the stabilization reserve, using other sources of funds, reducing costs, borrowing, or using any other source of funding, including making appropriations from the general fund or other funds. So there was an intent outlined in Act 122 that that the General Assembly reiterated by indicating that they wanted to relieve school boards of the responsibility for responding to the projected fiscal year deficit through school budgeting decisions for fiscal year 2022. The simplest way to say that is they didn't want to affect the FY22 budget process by a deficit that was created in 21 as a result of the coronavirus. So in the provision that was reflected in the passage in the most recently concluded session, they were specific in directing the commissioner that tax rate recommendations would not reflect the General Assembly's express intent in Act 122, and they directed the commissioner to calculate and recommend statewide education property tax rates for fiscal year 2022. And the specific language directs the tax commissioner this way. It says, when calculating and making recommendations for the fiscal year 2022 property dollar equivalent yield, income dollar equivalent yield, and non-homestead property tax rate, the commissioner shall, 1, disregard the projected deficit in the education fund for fiscal year 21 and assume that the stabilization reserve created under 16 VSA 4026 is maintained for fiscal year 2022 at the fiscal year 21 amount published in the Ed Fund Outlook on or before December 1, 2020. So there's a lot of language there, but the operative language is the tax commissioner was directed not to consider the deficit when calculating property tax amounts and yield amounts so as to relieve school boards of having to make up that deficit, as it were, as they would have under current law. So to follow up on Mark Peralt's explanation of the Ed Fund, it's a positive trend that Ed Fund revenues are up. We are still going to collectively have to contend with, I think, the economic fallout of COVID-19, but the General Assembly expressed a lot of positive intentions in terms of school district budgets by directing the tax commissioner to prepare his letter in December with the considerations that I just discussed. We can come back to that if we need to in the question and answer period. I think the next section here is average daily membership, which I'm also going to cover. Back in June, your association started to hear concerns about potential declines in school district enrollments attributable to instability resulting from COVID-19 dynamics. Family decisions to homeschool students was one factor cited, although there are other factors that might have seen a decrease in enrollment this fall as we navigate COVID-19. Association representatives, those folks on the call today, legislators, and Agency of Education staff suggested that stability for the FY 2022 budget year could be supported if districts were afforded a hold harmless provision that set the 2020-2021 average daily membership for a district at a level not less than the district's 2019-2020 school year ADM. The General Assembly approved a provision in H969, the appropriations bill, which just does just that. And the language can be found in H969, section B 1118, which says, notwithstanding existing law, for the 2020-2021 school year, the Secretary of Education shall determine the average daily membership for each school district at a count of not less than the district's 2019-2020 school year ADM. So that provision means that your ADM would not be less than what it was last year. If you have an increased enrollment, then your ADM could go up. That concludes those two sections that I was responsible for.
Thanks. We lost Neil to a power outage. So I'm going to ask Mark and Brad to discuss the COVID relief funds and what the legislature decided to do with those. Mark, if you could get us started, and then Brad, add any comments.
Sure. So I can just go back a little bit over the legislative history a little bit with you. In the Q1 budget that was passed earlier this year, the legislature appropriated $50 million of the state CRF allocation to K through 12. $6.5 million of that was made available to Efficiency Vermont for HVAC projects, and another $41 million was available directly to K through 12 for summer meals, a small amount for independent schools, and there was some money available for accounting. In the House restatement, when the House was dealing with this in the more recent session in August, they realized that the appropriation was going to be insufficient. So they bumped that amount up from $50 million to $82.4 million, or about another $32.4 million on top of what had been appropriated in the Q1 budget. The HVAC appropriation went up from 6.5 to 11.5. The $41 million for Kuwait K-12 went up to 68.4. And there was some other money moving around in there. The technical assistance money wasn't necessary, and there were some other small changes, but the big news here is the increased money. In the final restatement, once the Senate got the bill, they realized that the House appropriation was still not sufficient. So they ended up adding another in the end, another $53 million on what had been appropriated in the Q1 budget. So to boil it all down, Efficiency Vermont got 13.5, K through 12 got about 88 million, and that brought the total up to 103 million, which was $53 million over what the administration had proposed earlier. Those are the appropriations. There's a lot more to go on there, but I'll hand it over to Brad from there if he's comfortable.
Sure. I'm not sure where to go from there.
Or
yeah.
question.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think you covered it, Mark. There's a significantly larger pot of money. Is it still going to be enough? I think so. I don't know that yet. People are still changing some of their grant application budgets, so I don't really know what's happening with that. The HVAC money has thrown a bit of a wrench into things. That increase, from talking to Efficiency Vermont, it sounds like they are going to be able to fully fund all of the projects they've already started and begun. So they fully funded some, but not all, but they're going to fully fund them all. And then they've got another roughly 20 or so in the works that they're doing. They're doing scope of work right now, and they expect they're going to be able to fully fund that. So those projects also. And what they're fully funding on, I don't want to spend too much time on Efficiency Vermont, but what they're fully funding is what they're deeming to be a necessary upgrade to the HVAC systems in the schools. And they're making those determinations based on CDC and ASHRAE guidance that has been put out on how to mitigate COVID-19 to the best that they can with the HVAC systems. So they're working on that. That will be pulling money out of the CRF LEA applications, which are the other piece that we're talking about, that bigger piece. And there's discussion amongst business managers as to what goes where in that, which in turn ties back into what Mark was saying about the Ed Fund and not having some of the CRF money or the ESSER money in there yet. That's going to theoretically help offset that $67.1 million deficit in there. The language from U.S. Treasury has allowed for some budgeted monies to be repurposed. If they're repurposed, let me rephrase that. If it's budgeted money that was already in a budget and is repurposed for a substantially different use, that is reimbursable if it's a use for COVID related, for reimbursement by CRF. That money could in turn be used to offset education fund payments because they have the money up front, and that money would then offset that $67.1 million deficit. Same holds true for the ESSER money, which has broader uses and is easier to deal with. There's pushback from a lot of people as to how much of that is going to happen. And so I don't know how much, I don't even have an estimate at the moment for what is going to be able to offset that $67.1 million deficit in the Ed Fund, projected deficit in the Ed Fund. At the end of the session, we were at about $27.2 million of CRF money that would offset that, but I'm not sure where we're going to end up right now. We're still trying to figure that one out. In terms of where those grants stand, we've pretty much seen grants from everybody. We've pretty much reviewed them all. Any questions that we had have been sent out, and we're kind of filtering back, the answers are filtering back in. We cannot write the grants themselves until we know what the total amount of ask is for people from their grant applications. And that is because if there is not that roughly $88 million is not enough money to cover it, we need to figure out how the money is going to be spent out. What we will do first is we will completely cover all of FY20 expenses that come in. We will then cover all the FY21 unbudgeted expenses that come in that are COVID-19 related. And then lastly, if there's not enough money, we will prorate how much people are getting in terms of the repurposed money that will be helping the Ed Fund deficit. So that's kind of just a very high level overview of how the money is going to be flowing. I'm anticipating, and I don't know this for a fact, yet I'm anticipating that we'll be able to get grants going out fairly soon, like within no more than 2 weeks at the most, which is hopefully far sooner than that. But again, we need to get everybody's grant in first. And I have not heard back from some of the people that I have asked questions of yet at this point. The language also allowed the 3 standalone technical centers, the regional centers, technical centers, school districts, they were excluded from everything. The new language and act in, Sandra, you said it was Act 154 now instead of H 969. I didn't know that. They allowed them to be considered school districts for applying for CRF money. So they're in the process of getting their grants written and sent in to us too. So that all comes into play. So that's kind of where it stands in terms of the process and where we are. I think there's going to be enough money to fully fund everything, but I'm not certain. I think it might be close, but we shall see. There's also the possibility that if there's not enough money in this appropriation that Mark was talking about, that if the state has other monies left over, other CRF monies left over, that they can be potentially put to use for the school districts. We'll see how that goes. I'm not sure how that will play out, who will have demands on that money. Trying to think if there's anything else in terms of broad overview on that. In terms of ESSER, which is that other pot of money, my understanding is, and from what we've seen, a lot of folks are waiting to apply for their ESSER money and their ESSER grants once they figured out what they're going to do with their CRF money and how that's all going to play out, which I understand. The CRF money, as you all probably know or are well aware, ends at the end of December, on the end of the day, December 30th. It's dead. It has to be used by then. The ESSER money has a much longer period. It was written in law out to September 30th, 2021, but the Tidings Amendment comes into play, and the Tidings Amendment gives them an additional year to use it. So it actually goes out till September 30th, 2022. My guess is it'll be used long before that, but that money lives a lot longer than the CRF money. So that's a good part of the reason why people are waiting to decide how they're going to use it, and also
Mark,
to backfill CRF when it ends.
Mark, can you tell folks on the line how much the ESSER money is for Vermont, as well as briefly explain where we're at for the equitable services saga, what it was, and then what it now is in terms of.
Mark, are you comfortable with equitable services, Mark?
No, I can answer
Okay.
the first question, not the second one.
Okay.
The first question is the ESSER money was 31 million for the state, and I think 28 million dollars of that is available for K through 12. It's also possible that at the federal level, the guidance may be they may make the guidance less restrictive. It's also possible we'll get another stimulus bill. So there's other things that possibly could come down the line that would make this better. But equitable services, I do not know anything about.
So equitable services, there was a good one. I believe you all just received emails from Secretary French yesterday, the day before, something like that, talking about that. We've kind of held back saying anything until we were sure what was going on. The initial language that came out from in the CARES Act about the ESSER money said that if you accept the ESSER money, if you're an LEA, i.e. a supervisory union, supervisory district in Vermont, if you're an LEA in Vermont that accepts the ESSER money, then you have to provide equitable services in the same manner as you do Title I for the kids who are going to independent schools that are being tuitioned out. And so that was based on poverty. Without going into all of it, which because you guys are all probably very familiar with it at this point, US Ed and their secretary changed how that was going to be. There was pushback. They came out with an interim rule that had the effect of law that gave people two choices. That went to court. US Ed lost in 3 different federal court cases. And about a week or maybe 2 weeks ago, US Ed came out and said they were not going to appeal the decision. So we're back at the starting point where equitable services will be funded based on the poverty counts of the within the supervisory unit and any kids of theirs from their region that are going to independent schools. So that has been resolved finally. And we finally got information out on that one, I think, as I said, a day or 2 days ago, something like that. So there is now some finality in that. So, you know, the one thing to remember in that is the ESSER money and the equitable service money are not Title I dollars, and they do not have to be used like Title I dollars, just calculated out the same way as Title I dollars are for equitable services. So they do not have to follow, because they can be used by an independent school on all of their kids, not just the ones who are driving that money like Title I dollars would be. The same holds true for the public schools. They can be used anywhere, anyway, with the remaining ESSER monies. And if there are questions on equitable services, I will do my best to answer them.
Thank you, Brad. We're changing up the agenda, panelists, a little bit to reflect Brad's comments. So Nathan, I'm going to invite you to provide any comments from VASBO's perspective on how this is playing out on the ground in the school districts.
Great, thanks. Well, I can say, as Brad said, you know, we're still kind of in the infancy of getting through the application process here, and I think that there's going to be a lot more. We'll be able to speak with more confidence about kind of how far the money is going to go when that happens. But I think we're all pretty confident that the legislative action leaves schools in about as good a position as we could have found ourselves in, meaning that we are likely to get fully reimbursed for all of our eligible COVID response costs through the CRF funds for the year that closed already this spring. So that was fiscal year 20, and also for get all of our costs covered through the end of December this year. The fact that any prorating will be applied first to those costs that would flow back to the Ed Fund means that local school budgets should not find themselves kind of bearing the burden of those costs, which I think was, really the intent of the CRF fund. So I think that's really encouraging news, and we're all happy about that. As Brad mentioned, there's another source of funds out there, the ESSER funds, and I believe that some schools have applied, but in many cases, we are waiting because the longer time horizon of those funds allows them to meet needs that will come up beginning this January and extend potentially through the end of the school year, because the absence of CRF funds at that point will make it necessary for schools to, or if it is necessary for schools to continue spending in response to COVID, they're going to be looking to a source like that ESSER funds to the extent they have it available. So that is a different source of funds. I think that's important to understand, and the allocation of those ESSER funds to schools is different from CRF. The good news about CRF is that schools are we expect generally schools to be awarded, we expect schools to get a CRF award that is consistent with their application, let's put it that way, meaning that unless proration is necessary, everyone will kind of get a full award. The ESSER funds have a different distribution method that I believe is based on Title I allocations, as opposed to what schools expect to actually spend. So that could mean that schools need to be potentially more judicious in how they spend their, or how they spend in response to COVID beginning in January. But that, right now, January seems like a long ways away when it comes to understanding what our responsibilities and challenges will be related to COVID. But I think that's worth keeping in mind.
Thank you, Nathan. With that, let's transition to Jeff and an update on the HVAC program.
Thank you. Brad covered some of it, but I'll give you the overview. I've been in regular contact with Efficiency Vermont, who is administering the HVAC program, including conversations with them yesterday about specific status on the program. So as a refresher, when all was said and done, there was $13.5 million of CRF monies allocated to the Indoor Air Quality Grant Program, which is being administered by Efficiency Vermont because of the long-standing relationship that they have with school districts around the improvements to their HVAC systems. This money was specific to improve heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, and to do so in reference to COVID-19 specific guidelines that have come forward from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. Eligible schools were the public school buildings in Vermont and the approved independent schools, of which we think there are 411 eligible schools. As of today, 313 eligible schools had submitted intake forms to Efficiency Vermont. Of those 313, 250 were public schools, and the remaining 63 were approved independent schools. So if you look at that on a percentage basis, of the eligible public schools, 80% submitted intake forms. If you look at the approved independent schools, 64% submitted intake forms. As of right now, Efficiency Vermont has approved $5.8 million in projects at 121 schools and executed sub-grant agreements with LEAs to support those projects. They are currently vetting an additional $6.3 million in projects at over 200 additional schools. Brad mentioned the integration with the CRF applications that school districts had submitted, some of which had project overlaps, which is being sorted out. It's also worth noting that within that total allocation of dollars, all enrolled schools received an indoor air quality monitor. Efficiency Vermont's been providing trainings to schools on how to monitor setup and usage of that equipment. And Schools have been providing Efficiency Vermont with research findings and guidance on other common standalone measures like air purifiers. So in summary, there was a sizable amount of money that was deployed over a short timeline in order to improve air quality in schools in response to the COVID-19 crisis. There's certainly will be a lot of work left to do even after this money is spent. And also worth noting is that the projects have to be completed by December 30th, 2020, or subject to a scope of work that would indicate that it would be completed. So one of the shortcomings of racing to get all this money out, and it's a federal requirement, not a state requirement, could be problems in some areas because of demand for contractors to get the money out. That stated, when you consider how this all came about, I think that all the parties, school districts, agency of education, state government in general, the contractors, and Efficiency Vermont have done a pretty good job turning into this issue of improving air quality in schools. So that's the update on the HVAC programs.
Thank you, Jeff. Brad, could you give us an update on school meals reimbursement and transportation reimbursement? You are on mute.
I did that because you told me to, and I remembered. The Act 120, no, it wasn't Act 120. Got pulled out of the Act 120 money, which is the end of the session at the summer. Another act, which number I've forgotten, maybe it was Act 124 or 5, something like that, dedicated $12 million to summer food programs from the CRF money. That came out of the $50 million that the legislature appropriated for K-12 or pre-K-12 and Efficiency Vermont and everything. Of that was money that was specifically for pretty much July and August. I think the language said June for end of the school year through to the end of August. Of that $12 million, roughly only 2.8 million of it was applied for and granted out. That left close to $9 million left over. That rolled back into the money Mark was talking about, that total of $103 million that has been appropriated to us all told for schools. Of that money that came back in, $4 million of it was set aside more or less for continued summer food programs, not summer food programs, but school food authorities. There are too many S's in these things and F's. School food authorities and child nutrition programs. So there's money that's specifically, that $4 million specifically set aside for them for the same type of costs that they've been incurring over and above their normal costs. So there is money that is dedicated to that. It is CRF money. It is still, if it's not used from that, it can be done in the other CRF grant. So that money is there. So it's I don't think the demand came through as much as we expected to in the summer, probably because it came out so late and people already had made some decisions at that point. But the intent was there, and some people used it, and so and some people may not have chose to use it and put it in their CRF LEA grants. For all I know, I don't know. So that's that. Transportation, there was a big discussion a long time ago about transportation because when schools were initially closed right away, they were, a lot of schools realized that they had food issues with some of their students, and so they started transporting food to, and rightly so, transport food and meals to their students via their transportation system, via their buses and their busing contracts and such. The way the language is was currently written in Title 16 is that was not allowable cost for transportation reimbursement, which happens on those actual costs 2 years down the road. That's the transportation grant people get. So what the legislature did now is they rewrote it in the big bill, and they said that those costs, transporting of food and other, what term did they use? Other, I have it written down here somewhere. other necessary things, other aid, something that has to do with COVID, those are now eligible costs. So they will be eligible for the transportation aid 2 years down the road, unless people are putting in for those costs as a reimbursement for CRF. Then you've already been paid for it, which is actually a better deal because you're fully paid for it at that point. So that's kind of where the transportation stands. The legislature did do that. I'm not quite at the last minute, but it was close to the last minute when they got that in there. So we talked about it at the end of the other session. And I think that covers that piece, unless, yeah, those two things.
Thank you. Mark, could you just briefly explain the expanded definition of the school district in terms of accessing funds? I believe it has to do with technical education. Sandra can correct me if I'm wrong, though, on that.
That's correct. Brad actually touched on this earlier. The Q1 budget, the initial appropriation of CRF monies inadvertently excluded the regional career technical centers from eligibility. And the restated budget has language that for the purpose of the CRF appropriation, these centers are defined as school districts. So they'll be eligible for some of the money. Also in the tech centers, one thing we didn't mention was the administration has some gear money, an additional allocation of federal money, about $4.5 million. And that money we understand will be distributed to all regional centers, regional technical centers, and to support new initiatives. So it's not an ed fund issue, but it is additional money.
Yep, I'd forgotten about that too. Thank you, Mark.
Before we move to questions for this segment, welcome back, Neil. And I just want to open it up if anyone has any comments that might have been missed in this financial portion of the agenda, to just provide comments from the panelists. All right, after a long pause.
So Chelsea, if I could just jump in, if anybody's interested in delving into this in more detail, Chloe Wexler from our office posted on our website a one-pager that lays out the appropriation of the CRF money for K through 12 in a really concise manner. So Chelsea, I can send you a link to that if you're interested, but it's
excellent.
available.
Yeah. For those listening, when I send out the recording, I will also send out that resource. We have a question that is, can HVAC being covered by both EFBT money can HVAC be covered by both EFBT money and CRF? If EFBT approves of the repairs but only covers 50%, can the other 50% be put through CRF?
This is something that's going to come out in the next day or so, because I just wrote a memo to send to Secretary French for his approval. The decision was made, you guys get first news on this. The decision was made that HVAC costs for these projects that will be covered by Efficiency Vermont should not be in the CRF LEA grant, unlike what I initially had told people, because I was the one telling people to put them in there if they weren't fully funded by HVAC. The largest reason for that is because the money the additional money that was $7 million that was appropriated to Efficiency Vermont, they feel fairly confident they're going to be able to fully fund everything they've got going on. If there's money left over, because some of the projects will not be able to be completed and even get really, because you're going to be waiting for big pieces of equipment that it can't come in before the timeline is up, they'll probably have additional money. They'll probably get some others projects started in school districts that have not yet applied. But basically what it boils down to is Efficiency Vermont feels that they will be able to fully fund all their projects they've started and have not fully funded yet, all the projects they have in the works right now that they're currently reviewing. So the decision was made that those monies should come out of the CRF funds, CRF LEA funds, which are the ones that we're managing. And so the people will be able to reallocate those to something else if they did not cover everything they needed to cover in their initial application to us. So the answer now is no, they cannot be under both. It has to be under the HVAC with Efficiency Vermont. So breaking news.
Thanks, Brad.
I'm not sure people really wanted that, but you're welcome.
It looks like we have one more question, and it's a very lofty one that may be above all your pay grades. How do you recover $67 million of a shortfall from the education fund?
I think
Well,
that's answered by Mark and Brad. It's their responsibility to fix that.
yeah, I'll start, Mark, if you want me to.
Sure, go ahead.
Again, as I said when I was initially talking, the U.S. Treasury guidance on the CRF money, they're in charge of the CRF money, has said that monies that are budgeted, first of all, CARES Act money for CRF says that one of the things you can't do is use it for budgeted purposes. But then U.S. Treasury guidance came out and said that you could use it for budgeted costs that you repurpose and use for substantially different reasons than what it was budgeted for. Thinking in terms of that, then there could be a significant amount of money that could be, especially in FY20, that could be applied to that criteria, where budgeted money was used for substantially different purposes. CRF could replace that. What legislation said was that if that occurred, then that would give the school districts a surplus. That surplus would then automatically roll over into FY21 spending, and it would reduce education fund payments that had to go out to school districts because they had already been reimbursed by the CRF money. At that point, the school district would be whole. The Ed Fund would then have not sent money out. That would drop to the bottom line. The numbers, again, as I mentioned last time, that we had talked about preliminarily towards the end of the legislative session that just closed, was about $27 million. And that $27 million in CRF money would have gone directly towards that $67 million deficit, bringing it down to 40. Then there's potential that some of the ESSER money will also be used that way. My guess is it probably won't. There's not as much ESSER money, and a lot of the ESSER money, from my understanding, is going to be backfilled for people who are hired, paid for by CRF money the first half of the year. ESSER money will carry them for the second half of the year. But if there is some of the ESSER money that can be repurposed legitimately and used to offset the Ed Fund deficit, that would help too. And then you come to the issue that Mark was talking about with the reserve. I'm sitting there. Now I'll turn it over to you, Mark. I got you down.
So, yep, the only thing I would add to that is even if all that happens, there's still going to be a deficit in the education fund. And back in Act 122, which was passed back at the beginning of the session, the legislature laid out basically a kitchen sink approach to dealing with it. I don't think there's any possible thing in there that they didn't list, but it was other sources of revenue, reducing costs, borrowing, including interfund borrowing, and any other source of funds, including an appropriation from the general fund, which seems kind of unlikely. But the intent is to not have that problem addressed on the property tax. And beyond that, it's really hard to say how we're going to deal with it.
Thank you. We have a question that says, how much is ESSA up or down? So I am not sure if there's a clarification on that question. But if you do have a clarification to the question asker, please let us know and we'll address it in a later segment. With that, Neil, I think you can transition us to the following segment.
Thank you, Chelsea. I was actually wondering, can I squeeze one question in for this topic?
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, and I apologize if this was covered maybe while I was out of power. Do we continue, what's the forecast for rooms and meals taxes? Or do we think that those will continue to come in under what we maybe previously thought they would, and what sort of impact that might have on the Ed Fund longer term?
Yeah, so I can take a stab at that. It's not something I'm totally up to speed on, but my understanding from our last staff meeting is that, first of all, we're not going to get another revenue forecast until mid-January. So the numbers that are on the Ed Fund Outlook at this point are going to remain there for the time being. We do know that sales tax revenues are coming in much stronger than we expected. And I think meals and rooms are sort of chugging along about where we thought they would be, which is not great. But right now we're $12 million up for the year over the forecast for the non-property tax revenues, which includes meals and rooms sales and purchase and use. So there is a hit there. It wasn't nearly as bad as we thought it was going to be in FY21. In FY22 so far, in FY20, in FY21 so far, it looks like revenues are coming in quite a bit better than were anticipated back and in the August forecast.
All right, thank you for that, Mark. And I believe, Chelsea, did you guys sort of reorder the agenda? Which piece are we moving on to now? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so we are moving on to the other legislative changes.
Okay. I think then the first up on there was labor relations. And I think, Sue, you might have some information for that one.
I do. Sorry, I had to find my button. So under labor relations, there's one bill that I wanted to make you aware of. It's S254. There was a little bit of conversation about it earlier in the webinar. This is a bill that makes changes to the processes for unit determination, certification, and representation of a union. And it gives employees who are members of a union the right to automatic dues deductions. The bill also provides unions with an opportunity to meet with new hires to discuss union membership and service, as well as provide unions with contact information for those new hires, and requires employers to present unions with a list of employees in the bargaining unit and their contact information on at least an annual basis, to the extent that the employer is in possession of that contact information. And the contact information includes a teacher's or administrator's home address, personal email address, and home and personal cellular telephone numbers, to the extent that the school board is in possession of that information. That list must be kept confidential by the school board and the union, and is exempt from copying and inspection under the Public Records Act. There are also some new timelines in the bill, which are set out specifically in the bill, but there's also a provision within the bill that the Labor Relations Board can, upon the request of any party or on its own motion, extend any time period for good cause, provided that the election that occurs has to be conducted within not more than 60 calendar days after the petition is filed. And then further, there's a provision that the board can further extend the date to conduct the election by not more than 30 additional calendar days upon mutual agreement of the parties, or if it determines that there have been some kind of extraordinary circumstances that have made an extension necessary. This bill was delivered to the governor yesterday, and as far as we know, has not been signed yet.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Chelsea.
No, I forgot you were back, Neil. Go.
That's okay. I am very relieved to know that my presence here was not required and that you guys were able to carry on without me. But that being said, I think Jay, you're up for the next two. One on contraceptives and the other one on uniform licensing standards.
Sure. So House Bill 663 passed into law. This bill, amongst other things, would require schools with students in grades 7 through 12 to provide condoms free of charge to students beginning on July 1, 2021, so for the beginning of next school year. And these would be provided free of charge for students. They need to be in locations that are safe and readily accessible to students, including the school nurse's office. This bill also, majorly because of testimony from some of our associations, provides an exemption of mandated reporting solely on the basis of making condoms available to a secondary school student. So it would be anonymous, students could take them, and the school would have no responsibility on reporting anything related to that. The bill also would direct the Department of Health to coordinate with stakeholders to make free over-the-counter contraceptives available in a variety of settings statewide. So this would not just be schools. And this section of the bill, as I mentioned earlier, would start for the beginning of next school year. Many of our high schools already provide these free of charge, but now would be mandated by law. And Neil, I can go right into the next one too if you want. The last one here is the uniform licensing standards. This is in Bill Senate 233, and essentially it simplifies the process of obtaining a Vermont professional educator's license. It directs the Standards Board to develop new rules to address applicants with 3 or more years of practice and good standing in another state. This is something that all of our organizations support. It's to prescribe a process to find out, did they have equivalent teaching experience in another state? Did they earn equivalent credentials in say a military school or a school out of state or a school out of the country? The bill also amends Section 6 of Title 1694 by introducing a new pre-application criminal background determination that would allow potential applicants to know the outcome of the required criminal background checks for licensure. This is not a new thing for schools to have to do. It would be so individuals from other states could find out ahead of time, am I going to be licensable to work in the state of Vermont? And then they would know whether or not they would be eligible for a license based on the outcome of that check or pre-check, I guess you could call it. The bill doesn't make any other amendments to current laws requiring background checks for criminal background checks for licensure or employment. And it was signed by the governor September 23rd, and it will take effect on April 1st, with the idea that hopefully it will help for this upcoming hiring spring season. Neil, back to you.
All right, thanks very much, Jay. Chelsea, any questions from that last segment?
Yes, we have a couple. So we have, out of curiosity, what is the backstory of S-254? Sue's smiling. I think she wants to take this one.
Yeah, so I can give you a little bit of the backstory. It's a bill that it started in the Senate. VSBA provided some testimony about the timelines in the bill, which some of them were very, very tight. 2 days was in there a couple of times. And there weren't any changes made by the Senate based on VSBA's concerns about the timelines. But when it made it to the House, it sat for a while, and then in this special session, it came up again in the House Committee on General Military Housing and Military Services. And we raised basically the same concerns that we had in the Senate. And this time there were some other entities that also raised those timing concerns, including UVM and the Vermont State Colleges. And so the committee provided some time for I don't want to say parties, but I guess I could say parties, to confer and try to come up with something that was agreeable to everyone. So at that point, it was the unions and VSBA and Vermont State Colleges and UVM met for a significant amount of time. And through that meeting, we're able to come up with some agreed upon language that didn't have as tight of timelines. And the language that I was talking to you about at the end of my presentation that provided that the labor board can, on the request of any party or on its own motion, extend any time period for good cause. That was added in as well as sort of a stopgap measure to make sure that enough time was provided for all of these different processes to take place. within an individual process. So there is built in this provision that allows for extension of the time period for good cause, as long as the election occurs within not more than 60 days after the date that the petition was filed. And then there's also another provision allowing a further extension of not more than 30 additional days with a mutual agreement of the parties, or if there are extraordinary circumstances. So that at that point, the Vermont State Colleges and UVM and VSBA and the unions that were involved all went back to the committee and provided them with the agreed to language, and that was then substituted into the bill at that point. I believe I've answered that question.
Great, thanks, Sue. Jay, do the condoms to students include 7th and 8th grade as well?
Yes, they do. In Vermont, 7th through 12 is considered secondary, and the law specifically says 7th through 12.
And Jay, before you mute again, has the governor signed the contraceptive bill?
Am I on right now? I believe he has.
We got a nod from Sandra as well.
I checked the website. Yes, he has.
In contraceptive bill, will schools get money for supplying condoms and contraceptives?
What a great question. The answer is no. They actually said in the one version of the bill that schools could go out and look for grants, and I made it pretty clear to them that was very unlikely. But no, they just said it won't be a very high cost, and schools will just have to have it be part of what they do. We did make the point that it was an unfunded mandate.
All right, we have a correction to the question on ESSA. Says the real question is, once the nickels and dimes are all counted, how much deficit is left? Given the lack of a fairy godmother, are we not faced with an ooze out of the property tax?
You know, I could take a stab at it, but I really think we don't know at this point.
We don't. Yeah, I mean, it's regardless of what happens, the money's going to have to be paid back if they have to borrow money, unless there's additional money coming from the federal government that is not going to have strings attached to it that can be used for that. If they have to borrow money, it's going to be paid back somewhere through one pocket or the other, the ed fund or the general fund, probably somehow.
And the ed fund can run a deficit, so we can carry this out for a couple of years in the hopes that things get better at some point. But you know, it's at some point, you're right, it's going to have to be addressed.
Yeah. But if anybody knows a fairy godmother out there with deep pockets, bring her on.
All right, I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, well, kind of related to this, and I don't know if it was talked about before, but either Mark or Brett, do you know? We have heard some reports of some towns being pretty desirable places for folks to move to, you know, as a result of the pandemic. Has that resulted in any state level substantive change in student numbers?
Not that we've seen yet. We have not collected those data. We're in the census period now. Obviously I can't walk down the hallway now and just talk to people, say, what are you doing? But my understanding is that we are collecting ADM the way we normally collect it. It will be done through the registrars. They will be reporting as they have in the past. Those will not necessarily be the numbers that we end up using because of legislation that passed. But at that point, we'll be able to say, I have heard anecdotally that places like Winhall have seen a significant rise of kids. The numbers that I've heard bandied about on the numbers of about 50 additional kids coming in to, you know, what were second homes and now residences. So I'm hearing that. I'm not hearing about it from many other places though, except for the tuitioning towns, and it tends to be the smaller tuitioning towns that I've heard from in the southern part of the state. But that's, again, I'm not in contact with a lot of people to hear what's going on right now.
On the flip side, though, I think we've probably also seen a fairly substantial increase in the number of homeschooled students.
Again, I don't know. There's a difference between homeschool and remote learning. A lot of kids I know have gone to remote learning. That's not the same as homeschool. They would still be counted in, remote learning kids would still be counted in the ADM. Homeschool kids would not, unless they're taking a course with the school. How that would work for remote learning, I don't know. These are good questions. It's going to be an interesting year counting wise.
You know, related to that, if I could just jump in, I mean, there may be a bump in property values down the line as well too, because of that. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that people are paying significantly higher prices for the homes that they're moving into than we have them listed for. So it won't show up next year, but down the line, we may get a bump there.
That's right.
So some towns will be looking forward to a change in the CLA.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Chelsea, do we have any other questions?
Well, we do have a factual update to one of the comments. Win Hall is 31 students over budget, and there were 15 Go students budgeted for. So a little on the ground information.
Thank you.
Neil, I think you can wrap this up.
Okay. Well, I certainly want to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists this afternoon. Mark, Tracy, Brad, Jay, Nathan, Sandra, Sue, and Jeff, who is the man behind the curtain. Thank you so much to Chelsea for handling all the Q&A, and I think the moderating while I lost my power there briefly. And if there are no other questions, I guess, Chelsea, I want to thank everybody for attending. Let folks know that we will have, I believe, a recording of the webinar available in the future for folks that weren't able to attend, or for those that want to just review some of the stuff that was talked about today. But thank everybody for making the time today.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions.
Thanks.
Thanks all, and we'll see you soon.
Okay.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Where am I here?